Hi, this is Jeff Morris. Today I want to talk about data innovators using Datacoral. Today I'm going to discuss 5 of our customers. They're all startups, and they're actually all building data pipelines that help fuel the digital transformation economy. Really interesting stories and a great kind of example of how Datacoral adds value to their customers. So what I'm going to walk you through very quickly today is give you an introduction or a framework for the discussion about Datacoral themselves, ourselves, and then I will get into the data innovators. We'll talk about Greenhouse, an HR startup out of New York City. We'll talk about Front, a collaboration email box provider. We'll talk about Jive, who is operating in the gig economy, serving the grocery market. We'll talk about Cheetah, who's also a logistics company helping restaurants receive their food deliveries via mobile ordering. And Swing Education is an organization that's helping bring substitute teachers together with available classrooms. We'll make some additional observations toward the end of this event, and then I'll take a couple of questions. So as an introduction to Datacoral, our goal is to deliver a data infrastructure as a service. And this is for or targeted towards data consumers, analysts, data engineers, data scientists, to give them an intuitive SQL-based interface from which to build and operationalize their data pipelines. And we've built this, or those that are building this are experts in data infrastructure and data engineering from 21st century unicorns like Yahoo, like Facebook, growing them from terabytes to petabytes in terms of their data infrastructure, from AWS Redshift, from Groupon, MuleSoft, Splunk, and more. All of these are very, very rich data engineering and data pipeline construction experience. And what we're doing is we're building upon and within the native AWS cloud environment, we're helping eliminate tons of complexity within the data pipeline infrastructure market today. Right now there's way too much complexity in terms of supporting data pipelines, and the net effect that that's having on data engineers as well as the data consumers is that they're spending significantly less of their valuable time operating inside the data itself, perhaps performing transformations or building machine learning models. They're spending less time doing that high value activity because they're building data infrastructure capabilities. They're building capabilities around how the transforms might be scheduled or orchestrated, or they're troubleshooting the dependencies that are happening when data pipelines change. And that activity, while absolutely necessary to happen before they can go back to being inside the data, the infrastructure activity isn't where the value is. The value is in the data flow and what they can do with it rather than the infrastructure itself. So there's significant degrees of complexity here in this traditional ELT-based model: extract, load, transform, and then ultimately publish the data to where you want it to go. What we see is it's a highly competitive market, and there's lots of different tools and environments and products that support some degree of the pipeline exercise, but not its entirety. So you can see even in the extraction, there's a lot of manual activities that might be going on in there, displayed by the screwdriver and wrench activities. You have to custom code things to make them work perfectly. There may be unusual data sources that you're trying to connect to via API that need to get built up. There may be timings that you want to make sure happen that in terms of extracting the data from S3 and loading it into your data warehouse like Redshift or Athena or Snowflake. And those activities often require custom code. And I'm just talking about the data ingestion side, but then when you get into building a full transformation lifecycle and building full data pipelines, there's activities related to what the timings of any given transformation are, right? One is obviously going to be dependent on data coming earlier in the pipeline, being correct and being ready to go before the next level of transformation may take place. So that coordination is often orchestrated by products like Airflow or AWS Glue. Those kind of things are areas where we see a lot of custom build. And then the other area where we see a lot of custom build activity is in the area of publishing information. Where are you going to put that data? Is it going to go into your analytic tools? Is it going to help the data scientists build their ML models? Is it going to feed your operational systems that in turn need that refined or that curated data downstream? So those publishing activities are really important. And then, of course, the area that many organizations forget is the data pipeline is not a static organism. It's a growing, living organism that, of course, changes and matures over time. And it's being able to recognize those changes. Perhaps one of your extraction sources like Salesforce changes or adds a field to their infrastructure. You want your data pipeline to be able to pick up that change and automatically adapt to it rather than break the whole transformation or the whole ingestion and transformation exercises altogether. So there's a lot of complexity in these particular core sets of environments and activities. So what Datacoral is attempting to do is build around the AWS best practice. What they recommend for ELT is you extract your information from your data sources into S3 as your staging area. It's secured there, it's safely stored there for posterity, so you don't necessarily have to go backwards and reinstantiate the data from your sources. You have a clean copy of what was initially drawn into the environment stored in S3. Then you load that into your data warehouse. I'm going to talk about Redshift primarily, but this could be Athena. This could also be Snowflake, very easily swapped out. But these activities of getting the data into an environment from where you can begin those transformation exercises and begin the refinement exercise of your data pipeline. Then we'll talk about the transformation exercises. Ideally, you want to be operating in what your transformation people are comfortable with. You want to be using SQL. You want to be using their favorite SQL kinds of tooling for that inside and push that down into the database, because the database is where all of those transforms are going to both take place and perform optimally and scale optimally when you're doing so. And then finally, when you need to analyze the data, when you need to publish the data, when you need to operationalize the data, you have that capability there as well. But then there's these other areas that I mentioned earlier, the fact that you want a deployment to be very cost effective, and ideally you want it to be deployed using a serverless architecture. The reason that that's important is because it supports the industry's best pay per use or pay per consumption model of software billing. It's secured inside of your own virtual private your own virtual private cloud, your VPC. It's orchestrated end to end. So all of those timings, all of those one table needs to be completely filled before another view might be triggered and start another round of transformation. And it needs to be change aware. All of those are activities that Datacoral adds to this traditional best practice ELT. So earlier, we ran a webinar on what those core top 5 data pipeline requirements were. Now, those requirements, I'll summarize very quickly, was that number one, they're serverless. They minimize the excess capacities and support that best pay-per-use type of model so that you're only paying for what you use. That's really good. You're not having to over-provision your environment for your worst-case scenario. Right? The serverless environment will scale up to your capacities, whatever they are, and they'll scale back down to what your usage is on a regular normal day, without having to require you to over provision perhaps an EC2 instance or a database instance. We then operate that serverless environment installs within your VPC. It uses your security keys. and your data never leaves your control. So in situations where data is highly sensitive, like you're operating, for example, in this event, we'll talk about many of our customers are operating on information about employees and about candidates and about different types of users. All of that very likely contains personally identifiable information, PII, that you want to make sure is absolutely secure according to regulations like in Europe, it's GDPR, in California, it's CCPA, those types of data privacy regulations that require you to not only understand the lineage and the usage of that data, but allow a customer or a user to unsubscribe from your holding that data in your environment. Installing and operating inside of your own VPC allows you to control that and also provides safeguards for making sure that an organization like Datacoral does not see your data. We don't interact with your data. Your data never leaves your control. We never see it. We just see metadata and the operations of the pipeline. We see no values inside of the pipeline. So that's a really good model when you are indeed operating with sensitive data and needing to adhere to regulations like HIPAA or CCPA or GDPR, et cetera. The third one is orchestration. How do you, a pipeline is typically a series of transformations and consolidation of data that occurs. So this execution timing and understanding the dependencies of one transform to the next is really important. So having that full orchestration capability is one of these top 5 requirements. What we often find is that this is a requirement that's overlooked and therefore then needs to be implemented using a third party, an open source tool, or a specialty Amazon service that you may or may not have skills in. And of course, because it's an outside set of software operating on your data pipeline, you've sort of introduced a new degree of complexity that you might not want to have occur in your pipeline. And the fourth one is change awareness. This is the ability to recognize when those when you're looking at the dependency diagram or the dependency graph, if one of those upstream items like the schema of a table changes upstream, perhaps a data type changes or there's a new column available, you want to make sure that the rest of the data pipeline downstream is aware of that. And if it's going to create breakage, like if you change a data type, that might break things in the pipeline downstream. Whereas if you delete a column in the table, that too might break the pipeline downstream. Whereas if you add a column, that might be an opportunity to manipulate or change the transforms that happen downstream. All of those are really important. So having the ability to be change aware is indeed why we have this as a top 5 requirement. And then last is publishing. Publishing is often an exercise that is left to the customer to handle and not supplied by the data pipeline vendor, the analytics vendor, the data warehouse vendor, et cetera, is because, and they will do this under the auspices of, we don't know how and where you're going to use the data, therefore it's up to you to figure out how you want to publish the data itself. We give it to you through perhaps a standard API interface or something like that, but you're still stuck with writing all the code for that. Datacoral takes a different approach. We've come to realize that there are indeed a lot of very predictable targets for delivering data to perhaps your customer support system, your CRM system, your machine learning platform, those kind of environments, your analytic tool if you need to fill their warehouse with your warehouse information. All of those are indeed obvious kinds of publishing targets. So we support those. And that whole notion of creating the full life cycle of the pipeline where you start at raw data on the left-hand side and you deliver the data's value all the way through the pipeline on the right-hand side, that value may be in many different forms. It could be enabling a system, it could be enabling a data scientist, it could be enabling a business analyst, it could be delivering key metrics to customers. All of those are relevant values that a fully operating end-to-end data pipeline would require. So in terms of where do we grab our data and where do we publish it to, there's a gargantuan slice catalog that with over 75 different sources and targets that we support right now, and that grows all the time. Oftentimes it grows based on customer need, oftentimes it grows because we recognize that there is another one of these obvious downstream use cases that we want to support where in order to publish, let's say, a customer satisfaction number, to Zendesk, we need to know what their net promoter score was from a system that we've captured that earlier, perhaps that SurveyMonkey or something like that. Those are very, very relevant and drivers for when we might add different sources and targets to our catalog of integrations. We call our integrations slices. That's a play on the serverless microservices deployment design that we support. So each of these is actually a function as a service in the serverless world or a microservices world, and slice comes from the concatenation of those two terms. So what I want to talk about now are these core customers who are really interesting in terms of their use of Datacoral, what they're doing in terms of their just basic business model, and how they're gaining value out of the environment. So we'll talk about the talent acquisition platform Greenhouse. We'll talk about the collaboration inbox from Front. We'll talk about Jive, who's a labor platform for the grocery ecosystem. We'll talk about Swing Education, who are linking substitute teachers and available classrooms for their on-the-spot jobs. And then we'll talk about Restaurant Cheetah, or they're now known as Cheetah, linking restaurants and their food service deliveries via mobile directly. So a restaurant can keep track of what their core inventory is and when they can expect the arrival of their delivery out at the front or the back of the restaurant. There are really some incredible observations being made by these customers themselves. Greenhouse, right, states that their data science teams are able to focus on delivering value to internal, and external customers without ever worrying about tedious data plumbing. That's a quote from Aaron Gibraltar, the head of engineering. I recently had a conversation with Andrew Zerm, who's their chief data scientist, and he was one of the original data guys, and he recognizes as well that he's able to spend moving from spending about 20% of his available time working inside the data itself to moving to spending about 80% of his time working in the data, because he doesn't have to worry about hand programming his data pipelines, and he doesn't have to worry about data breakage, and he doesn't have to worry about understanding when some of his source systems are indeed changing underneath him and have to go and diagnose what that particular problem was. He wants to be a data scientist and a constructor of new information rather than, let's call it, a data doctor who's healing information inside the pipeline and trying to get it back to a steady state. Whereas if he's a constructor, he's building from one steady state to another more advanced steady state. Front, we have, they say they use Datacoral everywhere throughout the infrastructure to see patterns and develop strategies as they understand the world of their own customer churn. And it pretty much informs all of their product roadmap. So recognizing what the indicators are of a customer who is not using or not enjoying the full benefit of their platform, they're able to help diagnose and remedy that before the customer departs. And finally, Jive says it's like having an expert data engineering team for a fraction of the time and costs. We like to characterize this as enabling or making a data engineer 10 times more effective in their role than they would have been with something without Datacoral. So let's take each one of these customers, their background individually, and go through their stories themselves. Greenhouse, as I said, is a New York-based talent acquisition platform. They help HR departments find better candidates, throughout the hiring process. And in fact, part of the intelligence that they're trying to develop inside their system is to tell a hiring manager when, even if they can't identify which candidate it might be, when their pipeline is full enough that there is the next employee somewhere in that pipeline. They're recognized inside of New York City as a high growth startup, one of the best places to work according to Glassdoor. So they too are taking on this notion of creating a very, very positive, thriving culture within their organization and applying their own lessons into their products as well. So their core business problem back when Aaron and Andrew were starting to tackle their data integration problems was they didn't have central sources of customer data. Andrew was spending too much time on data extraction, parsing, and construction of the pipeline and not performing his advanced analytic tasks. They needed a scalable solution to many of these hand-coded processes, and they were typical data ingestion tools weren't necessarily meeting their security requirements because, of course, they're dealing in the world of HR. They have lots of sensitive data that they're trying to make sure that they are keeping as secure as possible. So their success results, Datacoral's runs inside your VPC model past their security requirements. They have a much better understanding of customer behaviors. They have a better understanding of in-app usage of their products, so they can tell what users like to do, tell what users don't like to do. Much of their activity is focused around gaining feedback from hiring managers, for example, and they run interview surveys and questionnaires through as a feedback mechanism from not only that hiring manager, but also the employees, the candidates themselves. So they've added information from Zendesk and Salesforce and Jira and Tatango as they're publishing, which they're publishing data to. And overall, they've seen improvements in visibility of churn candidates. They've saved an immense amount in their IT costs, and they've eliminated lots of their custom pipeline coding. So again, we've become an essential part of their core infrastructure. And as I said, in recent conversations with their data scientists, they do recognize that they would be in a much tighter, much more difficult space without the Datacoral infrastructure being able to automate and take care of the types of problems I've already listed out, that orchestration exercise, that pipeline breakage problem, the publishing to different systems sets of issues where to take advantage of the insights that Andrew's coming up with. All of those activities are things that they are enjoying now that they wouldn't have before. Our next customer is Front. And Front is a team collaboration inbox, an email inbox, and they're designed to help organizations collaborate more effectively, to communicate with their customers more effectively, and overall optimize the work experience of their customers and how they are working amongst different projects and, as I said, communicating with customers. What they needed was overall company performance metrics that were originally derived on paper and through Excel. They didn't have visibility into customer usage. They didn't understand what their customer satisfaction metrics were. They didn't understand what their overall awareness or growth drivers were going to be inside of their user base. So, and they didn't have the data engineering team to help assemble all of that information directly. So they want to gather information from both internal and commercial sources like Stripe and Delighted and Google Analytics and Salesforce. And ultimately, when they did build that pipeline inside of Datacoral, they became smarter faster, is one of their observations. They didn't need to add data engineering resources while they focused on making the data engineers more effective and focused on delivering better, truer analytics to their entire business sets of business teams. Visibility improved in application usage. Customer satisfaction went up. Their churn indicator lights went off much earlier in the process so that they could correct issues. And company performance became much more predictable. Jive is another really interesting startup here. They're operating in the grocery ecosystem. They're serving Safeway and Albertsons and Stop and Shop and Publix, and a number of different Kroger's, massive grocery retailers in the across 32 states. So what they're doing is really interesting. They're operating in the gig economy, and they have over 10,000 contract employees that they call jivers, who are performing in-store tasks like stocking, like inventory management, like merchandising on brand displays, like performing pick and pack exercises for home delivery services. So those employees are actually white labeled from Jive as employees of each particular grocery store. The core problems they're trying to solve was the supply chain was unable to actually have visibility to the brands that they're representing. So if a Frito-Lay product is being delivered to a store, they didn't have a way to connect Frito-Lay and corporate to what was happening at the last 100 feet of inside a store. So are the Tostitos selling or are they not? Did the end cap for the Super Bowl with the Tostitos display, we've all seen these, of course, was that something that was indeed driving purchases of Fritos and Tostitos and Lay's, et cetera, potato chips? So giving brands like that visibility into what's happening in store is one of the major benefits of Jive's information. And of course, they're automating, again, a very traditional paper and spreadsheet driven merchandising exercise. That exercise, I even had friends of mine who were coming out of college. They went to work for a national winery brand and were responsible for the merchandising of all of that stuff inside of Safeway stores here in California. And they were expensive salespeople that each had a company car so that they could get from one store to the next. They were responsible for maintaining inventory for that winery's different sets of products. They were responsible for the point of sale displays. They were responsible for the end cap displays. All of this for how that brand presence was being managed inside of each one of these grocery stores. It's an expensive endeavor for that winery to maintain their brand. So somebody's got to end up doing that exercise. And what Jive's value now is they're certifying, they can brand certify as well as store certify these stocking these Jivers who are able to go and deliver that right kind of merchandising model on behalf of each brand. So the results that they've seen is they've integrated their core system is a PostgreSQL database. That's what connects Jivers to the jobs they have to do and the inventory that they're actually managing, to Fountain, which is a recruiting platform, to Zendesk, their customer support platform, to Facebook ads. This is how they actually solicit for new Jivers themselves and onboard them. And NetSuite is how they pay them out. So they've automated this paper to digital both inventory process, the merchandising process. They've dramatically improved the transparency that the parent brands have about their products' performance inside of grocery stores. And they're able to reconcile that last 100 feet of what happens to the inventory once it gets into each store. It required no additional data engineering resources for them. They estimate that probably saved them something like $250,000 annually. And they've got a 360-degree view of each one of their Jiver community, so they know how to communicate with their core employee base. They know how to effectively deliver job opportunities for them and make that exercise very competitive for those employees themselves. So overall, a really, really interesting set of use case here in helping those labor logistics of getting the right employee to the right store as the delivery is arriving, so that they can offload product and ensure that it gets onto the shelves as quickly as possible. Imagine the net effect of that, for example, of the produce that you see in your supermarket. if it is not sitting on a pallet in the in the heat, if it's not sitting in the back room of the supermarket, but it's actually delivered to the to the refrigerated produce sections in a very, very short order, the freshness of your food is actually going to be noticeable for consumers. And the availability of that food is going to be noticeable for consumers. So it's a really great business model that has lots of positive effects throughout the entire grocery supply chain. Swing Education is another one of our customers who's actually helping serve school systems by helping them identify and find new substitute teachers or available substitute teachers at any given day. So they're helping address that teacher shortage by matching these qualified subs to available classrooms. They operate in California, Arizona, New Jersey, Texas, New York, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. area. Their core business problem was they needed to attract the effectiveness of their website as a recruiting tool for both teachers and school systems. They wanted to be able to track and reward teacher performance so that if they were a great sub and the classroom loved them, they wanted to recognize that, that performance. And they needed statistics to actually prove out their value to their forthcoming, their forthcoming school district prospects in their sales process. So they had a number of unusual data sources, including Datomic, Launch Darkly was another one. That's an A/B testing tool. Zendesk, Customer IO, Full Story as well, so that they can see what's happening inside of their website as they're as their users are interacting with it. So what they've their success results are they've got great A/B testing analysis on their website. They can map that not only to who liked what page, but actually how that impacts revenue performance. So they've taken the whole activity from how someone interacts on their site all the way down to whether that made them a sale or not. That's a really, really difficult marketing problem, of course, to solve, but they've actually cleared that one. They're recognizing improvements in sales productivity, in forecast accuracy, and a 90% reduction in their overall data transformation infrastructure and ELT costs. Again, making their core people 10 times more productive than they would have been before. And our final customer is Cheetah, and they're transforming this food service delivery logistics. So they too are San Francisco based. They're automating local food deliveries via their own mobile application. They're improving transparency overall, their food freshness, and affordability within their restaurant customer install base. They're available in 8 cities throughout California. They're serving over 2,000 restaurants. We see them, their delivery trucks outside of our street here in San Francisco. Their core problem was they needed supply chain warehouse data from a JDA Red Prairie system to gather inventory information and then match that to where that inventory was once it's loaded onto a truck, matching this to driver location and how quickly they're able to not only weave in and out of traffic, but also offload their supplies to each particular restaurant. So they match this to location, geologistics, driving directions for the driver themselves. And what they're seeing is they're saving their customers more than 2 hours a day in restaurant supply management. That's inventory management inside the restaurant itself. I have a restaurant background. I've worked there. My colleagues here, even at Datacoral, have. And having that ability to manage your restaurant inventory from a mobile application, recognize that immediately if I need to order more eggs or more something highly perishable like fish, that I can do so very, very quickly and expect and know exactly when that order is going to arrive back on my doorstep. I can get it back into my refrigerator. The food is fresher. My supply replenishment is more predictable. I don't run out of my customers' favorite dishes. All of those activities are helped by how Cheetah is indeed delivering their transformative food inventory management logistics to their customers. So let's talk a little bit now about some of these observations about these customers, because I think this is as interesting as the customers' business models themselves. Each of them are really, or many of them are automating supply logistic information, right? And that activity of better delivering both services and products to consumers is indeed transformative in this age of Uber and Uber Eats and all of these other types of systems, especially for perishable goods like food, like medicines, things like that that are indeed temperature or time sensitive. That's a whole new logistic problem that these organizations are all starting to tackle. They're also tackling service and human capital automation, and that seems to be kind of the next wave of where digital transformation and disruption are going to happen. This is delivering better efficiencies and transparency throughout the HR food chain in Greenhouse's case, or in reducing task waste. Our drivers for how to lower both hiring costs expenses, how to reduce expenses in Jive's case of how to reduce wasteful expense of having an employee standing around doing nothing kind of thing. Those are all how the service industry itself appears to be evolving based on both the needs of the labor force as well as the needs of those core services that are providing capabilities to their customers. The next observation is that SaaS applications in the age of the cloud are evolving from the old school of being driven from being available through ODBC or JDBC based driver technology. That's how we used to do things back in the 90s, to now SaaS application APIs. The interesting thing about these APIs, while they may indeed be more real time, they are also often proprietary. So those data sources are creating the hurdles for our data engineers to leap in terms of how to drive these new business models forward. How does a data engineer add value is take those unusual API-driven products and work them into their information pipeline as best they can. And in Datacoral's case, we help those data engineers be more effective at handling how those APIs behave, handling how to integrate that into the entire data pipeline. And ultimately, managing these cloud-centric data pipelines themselves are an area of waste and inconsistency that could be automated to expedite bringing these new applications and services to market. And in turn, helping transform the time that a data engineer spends inside the data doing the high-value data manipulation work from as my customer had mentioned earlier, from 20% of his time to about 80% of his time. And if you take what that core cost of a data engineer is and multiply by that 60% of his available time that they can actually move from working in the data, from working outside the data, that's a big value for any organization. So really, when we say we make these people 10 times more effective, it's really turning out to be true. Those kind of leaps are, imagine a data team who are all able to move from 20 to 80% of their time invested in data. Those are the kind of metrics that you'll see Datacoral continue to promote as we move forward as a company ourselves. But what I really love about this overall exercise of helping our customers is that we're able to offer them this end-to-end data infrastructure as a service that automates really tedious and low-value tasks within the data pipeline, so that those data engineers and those data scientists can use their SQL skills to add value to their to their particular role and ultimately add value to their organization. Instant value, 10 times productivity gain. They maintain security and control of their data. It's not being flashed through an outside service and then moved into your own AWS environment. It runs right there locally in your own AWS VPC. It's extensible, it's resilient and aware of changes. It scales dynamically because it's serverless. And it's very, very cost effective, again, because it has that elastic scalability that serverless deployments carry, which of course is the best pay per use kind of consumption model. You're never paying for waste. You're never paying for extra capacity. Those themselves are the values that Datacoral's bringing, and we're doing so ultimately in this, as ultimately as a data infrastructure as a service. So, to wind down and conclude this particular event, the prepared remarks for it is SQL itself is the constant that we want to continue to promote. That's the skill that everybody still has, knows, and is learning from, from very, very early ages, even in elementary and high school kind of grades or teaching SQL classes. But data interfaces themselves, they're no longer ODBC and JDBC, they're SAS APIs, they're big data APIs, they're new NoSQL dialects of query languages, they're cloud systems. So this creates unpredictable costs due to this, also due to SaaS licensing models, due to over-purchase capacity. These are things that are, in the age of the cloud, are creating data pipeline issues. And oftentimes, because there hasn't really been a known single end-to-end solution to the problem, the data engineering teams, the engineering teams in general, resort to their own necessity and start building their own data pipelines themselves, which of course, those become difficult to maintain over time, and they start to break either through atrophy or through changes occurring within the pipeline itself. So ultimately, because the pipelines are not flowing as optimally as they should be, the high skill data scientists, business analysts, executives themselves aren't getting the data when they want, where they want it. So by contrast, Datacoral offers an AWS native serverless environment. It securely runs in your VPC. We never see your data. It supports AWS best practice, ELTP, including publishing or computing in Python, and delivered as an end-to-end data infrastructure as a service, which orchestrates the pipeline. It's aware of flow, it's aware of timings and alerts, it's aware of changes to both schema as well as data values upstream and downstream, so you are aware of the impact of those changes as they may occur. And it publishes to analytic, machine learning, and operational systems, making it really a full end-to-end managed data service built by the people who did this before at 21st century unicorns like Yahoo, Facebook, Groupon, AWS Redshift, Splunk, MuleSoft. If you were to do what Datacoral is doing, you'd need to know over 100 separate APIs, products, and technologies to do so. If you know 10, that's great. I make you 10 times more effective. If you know one, that's okay. I make you 100 times more effective with the Datacoral offering. If you want to see more, investigate more of this kind of capability, please go to datacoral.com. We have an array of these success stories, as well as a lively blog post that talks about data programming. This is our philosophy of how data should be treated just like regular code is, and yet using SQL as your core interface to all of your data assets. I'm now able to take a question or two. So it appears we've got a couple of questions. Number one is, do you support, what are the warehouses that you support in, and can I have an existing data warehouse in Amazon Web Services? It's Redshift. Do you support that or other warehouses? The answer is, for that core warehouse where the transformations are stored and occur, we support Redshift, we support Snowflake, and we support Athena, which is a query language on top of an S3-based data lake. So we support many alternatives inside of Redshift for your data organization and warehousing needs. Second question is, what does the pricing model look like? Pricing for Datacoral operates along two dimensions. Now, as I mentioned before, it's serverless and it runs within your AWS account. So you may see Datacoral-based lambdas running within your environment, or you may see the effect of Datacoral running against your Redshift bill. But the way that we license our own product is really quite easy. It's based on 2 dimensions. It's the overall volume of data that you will be ingesting. We look at that typically on a rows per month kind of basis. And the overall number of those serverless microservices, those slices that we deploy. They can be deployed as data sources. They can be deployed as organizing capabilities, like running inside of Redshift or performing computational exercises in Python. And they also support publishing of those, of your refined data, your curated data to third-party systems. So we worry about, because those are the APIs and the interfaces that we need to maintain over time. We charge on that dimension as well as on the data volume dimension. Typical orders are between $3,000 and $5,000 a month annually. So anywhere between, let's say, 40 and 60K is what a typical Datacoral customer is paying. And when you compare that to the amount of data engineering resource that may need to go into managing and maintaining a handcrafted data pipeline, or a pipeline that uses a number of different products like data ingestion tools, and then something for orchestration like Apache Airflow, and then maybe a different data infrastructure product for publishing data. The inventory of the different tools that you might be managing could also dramatically go down and be offset by that cost of Datacoral. So that concludes my overall event today. We talked about some really killer customers of Datacorals. If you have additional questions or would like to explore more, please go to datacoral.com. And thank you for your time today.